This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Natalie Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Unexplained complications in the U.S. delay the return home of more than 300 South Koreans detained in an immigration raid last week. Now, an explosion at an army unit in South Korea injures at least 8 soldiers, 2 seriously. A practice artillery shell meant only for sound effect had caused severe burns. Now, China has joined global condemnation of Israel's attack on Hamas in Qatar, warning of an out-of-control Middle East conflict. Japan, meanwhile, says the airstrike in Doha undermines diplomatic efforts. Now, deflation still dogging China, with consumer prices falling in August at their fastest rate in 6 months, as policymakers grapple with sluggish domestic spending. Ahead on the bulletin, elite kindergartens and admission tests, not for kids, but dogs. We'll look at why poor parents in South Korea are paying big money and what happens if their pups don't make the cut. Now, the planned departure of South Koreans detained in a U.S. immigration raid hangs in the balance, with the foreign ministry in Seoul saying that the situation had become difficult. More than 300 South Koreans were among the 400-plus people rounded up by immigration officials last week at the site of a Hyundai motor and LG project in the state of Georgia. Well, they were scheduled to board a chartered flight to return home today. For the latest, TNA senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk joins us live from Seoul. So, Yun-suk, we're hearing that planned departure for the chartered flight to bring these detained South Koreans back from the U.S. might not happen on Wednesday local time after all. I guess the question at everybody's lips, what's causing this delay?
We don't know. I don't think anyone knows right now exactly what the problem is. But all we know so far is from this text message that the foreign ministry sent out to reporters on Wednesday afternoon. And according to that text message, the foreign ministry here says that the departure of our nationals detained in Georgia, USA, originally scheduled for September 10th, Wednesday local time, has become difficult due to circumstances on the U.S. side. And it says that South Korea is maintaining consultations with the U.S. side to ensure departure as soon as possible. But that is all we have right now. It didn't say as to what this issue was, what the circumstances were on the U.S. side that was not allowing the detained South Koreans to come back home. Now, meanwhile, a Korean air flight did leave South Korea's international airport on Wednesday morning for the United States to bring back home those detained South Koreans. And their plan was for them to arrive here on Thursday evening. But now that we get word that this is not going to happen, that there is a delay, and we don't know if they will be freed or, when they'll be freed, we'll just have to wait and see to see what happens between the United States and South Korea.
We're not sure if this is a silver lining, Yun-suk, but South Korea's Foreign Minister Cho Hyun, he is set to meet his U.S. counterpart later today. And what exactly is he hoping to achieve during the talks?
Well, yes, the foreign ministry here did confirm that its minister, Cho Hyun, will be meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio later tonight, local time. And on top of Minister Cho's agenda will be definitely the release of those detained South Koreans and to bring them back home. Because right now here in South Korea, there are lots of concerns about the safety of the detained South Koreans in the United States, especially there were pictures floating around, showing the condition of those detention cells. And also there are rising anger here in South Korea. And so if the South Koreans are not freed and allowed to return home as soon as possible, it is very likely that we will be seeing South Koreans out there in the streets protesting against the United States, which is supposed to be South Korea's closest ally. Now, also another issue will be for the Minister Cho Hyun to clarify with the U.S. whether those South Koreans being sent back to South Korea will be classified as deported or if this is going to be called a voluntary departure, because analysts here are saying that depending on how it's classified in the United States, it will decide whether the South Koreans will be able to return to the United States in the future, or they may not be able to return at all to the United States. And so Mr. Cho Hyun, he too was supposed to return to South Korea on Thursday, but now that the detained South Koreans' return has been delayed, it is very likely that Mr. Cho will be staying on in Washington until he can resolve this issue with the United States, whatever those circumstances or issues might be.
Quite a few things to hammer out there. Well, thanks very much for that report. CNA's Lim Yeon-suk reporting to us live from Seoul. Well, staying in South Korea, 8 soldiers were hurt in an explosion at a military base earlier this afternoon. 6 suffered light injuries, while 2 had severe burns. They were transferred by helicopter to a nearby hospital. Well, Yonhap News reported that the incident happened at an army artillery unit in Paju. That's an area bordering North Korea. Troops were practicing firing procedures without using live ammunition when the blast occurred. Now, a training shell that's designed to mimic the effects of an actual blast from a live round had exploded. The incident is being investigated. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has stressed that respect for his country's sovereignty is non-negotiable amid ongoing maritime disputes in the Indo-Pacific. Mr. Marcos, speaking at the inaugural Manila Strategy Forum hosted by CSIS, called for sustained U.S. presence that he believes is vital to maintaining a free and open region. The Philippine leader added that America's involvement in global affairs benefits everyone, including the U.S. itself. Now, he also thanked Washington for helping boost the Philippines' maritime security as Manila faces what he describes as illegal, coercive and aggressive actions in the South China Sea. Now, just last month, a Chinese warship collided with a China Coast Guard vessel while chasing a Philippine ship near the disputed Scarborough Shoal. It was the latest in a series of tense encounters as both Beijing and Manila seek to assert their claims in the South China Sea. Even today, Beijing is making more moves to put its stamp on the disputed region, with the China State Council approving the establishment of the nature reserve in the Scarborough Shoal. Southeast Asia's top defense chiefs held their annual meeting in Kuala Lumpur, with Malaysia playing host as ASEAN chair. The military leaders focused on deepening cooperation to address a wide range of threats, from cyber attacks and disaster relief to growing tensions in the South China Sea. Well, the talks also explored the formation of a combined task force among ASEAN member states and plans for the bloc's first-ever joint exercise. The defense chiefs agreed that their militaries must cooperate and prepare for evolving threats by scaling up joint drills and boosting operational frameworks. Now, at the meeting, Malaysia handed over the chairmanship to the Philippines, which will host next year's talks. This South China Sea remains a key flashpoint, where overlapping claims by China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei have long been a sore point. While the military leaders stressed the urgent need to finalize a long-delayed code of conduct with Beijing.
It's really very important that we do have a code of conduct that is respected by all, not just the ASEAN countries, but all countries in the region. Also, in the other matters, was the creation of an ASEAN-wide exercise. For the longest time, we have been doing unilateral exercises, bilateral exercises, but we haven't had an ASEAN-wide exercise. But as we saw already, in several instances, for instance, when disaster strikes, all of us come to the aid of each other.
Well, Australia says it will spend $1.1 billion on dozens of locally developed underwater attack drones, with the first batch to be delivered to the Australian Navy in January. Well, this move, which would boost the country's naval capabilities, comes as it ramps up defense spending. Canberra says that the vehicles, known as Ghost Sharks, are designed to perform intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance roles, as well as strike operations. The drones will eventually complement a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines procured under the AUKUS partnership, which will be delivered to Australia from 2032.
Ultimately, what this does is provide enormous capability to the Royal Australian Navy. It will work in conjunction with an enhanced surface fleet, which our government is in the process of putting in place. It will work with Collins-class submarines and in the future, our future submarines. This complements the work of the Royal Australian Navy and in the process provides a much more capable and a much more lethal Navy.
Well, Australia is in the midst of overhauling its military in response to what it perceives as growing security threats, such as China's growing military and its military deployment footprint. The country is also under US pressure to increase its defense spending to 3.5% from 2% of the GDP. Beijing, in response to moves to ramp up spending, has urged countries not to hype up the China threat narrative. Just last month, Australia agreed to purchase 11 Mogami-class frigates from Japan in a deal that's worth more than $6 billion. Well, the break's up next, but coming up on East Asia Tonight. Alibaba going head-to-head with Meituan as it expands its features on its mapping app to include lifestyle offerings. A Japanese car maker merging plants in the US as it wrestles with the impact of Washington's tariffs. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia Tonight. Well, we've got Roland Lim standing by now with the business news. So, Roland, it seems that China's crackdown on price wars is somewhat helping to ease producer prices?
Right, yes. Beijing has been busy curbing price wars and overcapacity in order to restore pricing power. Meanwhile, US President Trump is urging the EU to slap up to 100% tariffs on China and India over Russian oil. Now, Beijing has hit back at Washington's move to slap up to 100% on China. That's as President Trump tries to put pressure on Russia to come back to the negotiating table on its invasion of Ukraine. The country's foreign ministry says it opposes being used as an excuse and rejects any economic pressure placed on it, adding that it is not involved in the Russia-Ukraine war. The Trump administration has slapped India with 50% tariffs over its purchases of Russian oil. Trump's threats comes as some early signs emerged that China's sweeping policy aimed at ending years of cutthroat competition and oversupply in industries may be starting to impact raw material costs in the country. China's consumer prices slipped below zero for the first time in 3 months and fell at the fastest pace in 6 months as deflationary pressures persist in an economy at risk of a slowdown. Factory deflation eased for the first time in a year and a half, narrowing their declines in August. But it still remains in negative territory for almost 3 years, hurting profits of manufacturers will have to also weather weak consumer confidence and uncertainties stemming from U.S. tariffs. For more of this, we're joined by Gary Ng, who is senior economist at Natixis, joins us live from Hong Kong. Gary, good to have you on the show as always. With Washington floating steep tariffs linked to Russian-related trade, how exposed is China directly or indirectly?
Well, I would say that it really depends on whether China will actually further reduce its trade with the US, right? Because when you look at the overall share of the US, it has been declining over the past years because of the decoupling between the two countries. So China has been actively trying to export its goods towards other markets that we see that in ASEAN, in EU, the growth rate has been much quicker with that very big collapse from the US. So at this juncture, I feel that from the trade perspective, it's quite hard for the US to push China further on the Russian issue through tariff. It needs to be done through other type of interaction, like investment or different type of export control. But of course, let's not forget, China also has a leverage on, for example, rare earth and some other materials.
So where then do you see the tariff negotiations headed in the next 1 to 2 quarters? I mean, what indicators would actually tell you that the risk is actually shifting towards escalation rather than a delay or a suspension of trade talks between the US and China?
the number one thing to look at is definitely the level of tariff. And so far, we have been in a situation that there's a trade truce, which means neither side are actually acting further tariff towards the table right now. But beyond that, we do see this ongoing negotiation on the export control as well. At the moment, China is exerting more of this power over the supply chain, and we do see that a lot of this license, for example, through rare earth, it needs to be renewed every 6 or 3 months. The same is true for the US, the policy on chips or even on the planes component. All of this export can actually be changed from time to time. So for me, this will be the two key areas to look at in terms of looking at the relationship between the two countries. But again, in the Russia issue, I do think that it's quite hard for the US to push China towards the direction it wants. It will need to involve other countries like Europe as well.
Gary, looking at China's inflation number, CPI negative, but core CPI still positive. What does today's mix tells you about China's economy, and should we be worried about entrenched deflation expectations?
Well, even though we do see this sharp decline in the headline number, but indeed, if you look at the overall situation, it's not as bad, given that the core CPI is still doing relatively well. But having said that, it doesn't mean that there's not really this divergence between the manufacturing versus the service sector, even though there has been some improvement on the producer price. And definitely, we still see this issue of overcapacity being existing in the economy right now. And indeed, services seems to be performing slightly better, but we still need to look in the second half where the consumer confidence really rebounds, because a lot of this demand in the past seems to be also driven by the subsidies given by the government. And at the end of the day, we need to see income growth reaccelerating, and probably the wealth effect can also help as well.
And speaking of producer prices, the index has eased as authorities curb these price wars and overcapacity. Does consolidation restore pricing power, or does it actually risk stalling investments and jobs?
Well, I would say it's too early to say that this whole anti-inflation campaign is really having a big effect so far. And of course, from the verbal interaction, it's possible to see some firms deciding to maybe be less aggressive in competition and maybe not to cut price as much. But having said that, we still need to see demand rebounding to really see this healthy price growth again. And if it is really driven by the intervention by the government, it means that at a certain point in the future, companies will still face the sales target. It will need to find a way to offload the inventory, and it will mean changing the prices towards a lower level in exchange of quantity. And because it is pretty much a market decision, and I feel that what we see so far is probably not enough to really change this inflation trend as we see. So it's quite possible that in the next 6 months, producer price will remain in a negative contraction on a year-over-year basis.
Gary, very quickly, name 2 sectors where the anti-price competition policy bites and matters the most.
Well, I would say that when you look at this anti-inflation campaign, right, it is really about where the demand are and how company can actually regain more profitability. So I would say that in the retail sales sector, it is really a sector that will see growing divergence, that some firms may actually perform better, but it will face a growing price pressure. And on the other hand, when you look at communication services, which is pretty much the internet platforms, and we all know that they are under severe pressure. On the one hand, they want to gain a higher market share, but at the same time, they're not being allowed to compete in the same way as before. So I would say that these 2 sectors both have the opportunities and also challenges from this inflation trend.
Gary, we've run out of time. Appreciate your insights as always. Gary Ng, senior economist at Natixis, live from Hong Kong. Alibaba is stepping up its rival battle with Meituan, this time through its mapping app, Amap. But the app is launching a new feature called Street Stars, which uses artificial intelligence to rank restaurants, hotels, and tourist attractions for its 170 million daily users. Now, to start things off, Alibaba is offering 1 billion yuan, that's about 140 million US dollars, in subsidies, giving out coupons for ride-hailing and in-store services. The service will cover some 300 cities and list 1.6 million businesses. But the move takes direct aim at Meituan, whose Dianping app has long been the go-to for lifestyle and dining recommendations. Meituan quickly countered, announcing 25 million new coupons for takeaway orders from top-rated restaurants. The rivalry comes as China's tech giants compete fiercely in the so-called instant retail sector, flooding the market with discounts to attract shoppers. Regulators, however, have warned against aggressive price wars, especially as the economy faces weak property sales and job instability. Alibaba says AMAP's transformation could make it a new gateway for lifestyle services, but questions remain about how far regulators will let the competition go. Ministers from Malaysia and Cambodia have defended China's Belt and Road Initiative against criticisms that its investments create debt for partner economies.
I was always being asked by the media, is Belt and Road a debt trap? My simple answer to that is that no one put a gun in your head to accept or to adopt this project. It's a choice of the respective national government whether or not to adopt this initiative, and it's an option for developing countries to adopt BRI as an alternative to develop their countries in terms of their infrastructure. To the critics of BRI, they did not provide any alternative or any solutions to that.
For Cambodia, the Belt and Road Initiative is not a debt trap. And I repeat, it's not a debt trap. As some critics have suggested, on the contrary, it is a lifeline for our social economic development. It has provided the resources and partnership we need to build the foundation for growth, our infrastructure. Road, bridges, airport, power plants and canals are not burdens. They are engine of opportunity.
The two ministers were speaking at the 10th Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI Summit in Hong Kong. Now, China launched the BRI to help build infrastructure projects across nations, and this helps countries that may otherwise find it hard to get funding. But critics say it also burdens them with unaffordable loans, which in turn makes them vulnerable to coercion by Beijing. Today, about 150 nations are involved in BRI projects. Since 2013, cumulative BRI engagement reached more than 1.1 trillion US dollars. And within the ASEAN region, Chinese companies are reported to have invested 100 billion and created more than 100,000 local jobs. Cambodia has a number of BRI projects implemented, and China has also invested heavily in Cambodia's energy sector, prompting critics to be concerned about Beijing's growing influence in Phnom Penh. Toyota says it'll merge two of its Lexus plants in the US and move some of its production to Japan as it faces the Trump administration's auto tariffs. The company says the move is to focus on hybrid vehicles, which are seeing a rising demand in the US. The Japanese automaker currently produces two Lexus models in the US, the ES sedan and the TX sports utility vehicle, but will discontinue production of the ES sedan after consolidation. Despite the 15% levy imposed on auto imports, Toyota says it can still earn a profit by exporting its high-end Lexus models from Japan rather than producing them in the US due to high labor and material costs from building new factories. The 15% tariff, although lower than the earlier 25%, is still higher than the pre-Trump 2.5%. Expectations that the tariffs are here to stay have led Japanese automakers to restructure their supply chains and to raise prices. And you're up to date with the business news. Otelli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Israel's deadly attack on Hamas in Doha draws global condemnation. China firmly opposing what it calls Israel's violation of Qatar's territorial sovereignty. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. South Korea faces snags to bring home workers detained in an immigration raid, citing complications in the U.S. Seoul assures talks remain in place to secure their early departure. Deflation still dogging China. Consumer prices fell in August at the fastest rate in 6 months as policymakers grapple with sluggish domestic spending. And China joins global condemnation of Israel's attack on Hamas in Doha, warning of an out-of-control Middle East conflict. China says that it firmly opposes Israel's violation of Qatar's territorial sovereignty and national security. Well, the foreign ministry, adding to global criticism, stressed that it was, quote, deeply concerned that yesterday's attack could heighten regional tensions and that such action could undermine ongoing ceasefire negotiations over the war in Gaza. Japan has also described the attack as hindering diplomatic efforts.
我が国はカタールへの連帯を表明するとともに、イスラエルに対し直ちに交渉に立ち戻り、停戦の実現と人質の解放に向けて誠実に取り組むよう改めて強く求めます。
The strike took place as Hamas officials were said to be gathering in the Qatari capital to discuss a U.S. ceasefire proposal. Hamas says its leadership survived the strike, but 5 lower-ranking members were killed. The U.S. President Donald Trump says the decision to strike Hamas in Doha was made by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu alone. Mr. Trump added that his administration had warned Qatar of the impending attack, but Doha has refuted it, saying the call from Washington came during the attack, not before. Our Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani described the attack as state terrorism and a violation of international law. He said that Mr. Netanyahu was leading the region into an irreversible level of chaos.
نعتقد أننا اليوم وصلنا إلى لحظة مفصلية بأن يكون هناك رد من المنطقة بأكمل على مثل هذه التصرفات الهمجية التي لا تعكس شيء إلا تعكس همجية هذا الشخص الذي يقود المنطقة إلى مستوى للأسف لا يمكن إصلاحه ولا يمكن العمل وفق النظم والأطر والقوانين الدولية التي ضرب بها عرض الحائط.
Well, Blake Sifton explains the impact of Israel's strike on Doha on Israel-Hamas ceasefire negotiations.
This attack is damaging to those ceasefire prospects really for 2 reasons. To start with, it was an attack on the Hamas negotiation team while they were holding discussions on a ceasefire proposal that President Trump had put forth. It will be interesting to see whether they risk gathering in a group like that again for discussions. It was also an attack on Qatar. They are one of 2 pivotal mediators who have played a key role in negotiations and the release of some 130 Israeli hostages in previous deals. Hamas have also said that the son of their chief negotiator was killed in this attack, and that could very well harden his stance in future negotiations, make him less likely to make concessions. And Qatar are outraged by this. They've called it cowardly and a violation of their sovereignty. And throughout this war, they've hosted delegations of Israeli negotiators, of the heads of the Shin Bet, the head of the Mossad, military leaders, and they could very well withdraw from this process. And Israel would lose one of their vital mediators to reach a hostage deal and ceasefire. Now, the family members of the hostages held in Gaza are certainly outraged by this development. The mother of one of the hostages held in Gaza said that in attacking Qatar, Netanyahu had essentially killed her son because she believes that the likelihood of a deal is now much more remote. And an organization of reservist soldiers who are opposing the war and refusing to serve, they put out a statement saying this operation signals once again that the Israeli government is choosing military spectacles over serious diplomacy, putting the lives of the hostages and regional stability at even greater risk.
Well, the Singapore government is advising its citizens in Doha to exercise caution following those explosions. Well, its embassy in Doha says Singaporeans should avoid unnecessary travel and crowded areas and follow local authorities' instructions. It adds that they should register themselves online with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs so they can be contacted in the event of an emergency. ASEAN ministers are gathering in Malacca in Malaysia this week to discuss how they can strengthen collaboration on cross-border crimes. And these include online fraud, terrorism, human trafficking, firearms and money laundering. The leaders are expected to work on a framework to tackle transnational crimes in the next 10 years. The crackdown on scam center operations, one such transnational crime, has garnered attention even from outside the bloc. The US has announced a fresh round of sanctions on operators in Cambodia and Myanmar. Washington says criminal networks have siphoned some billions of dollars from Americans last year, while subjecting thousands of people to what they call modern slavery. CNA's senior correspondent Melissa Goh shares how effective these new measures are.
The U.S. Treasury Department has imposed sanctions on 9 companies and individuals in Sri Kokko, known as KK Garden, near Thai-Myanmar border, as well as about 10 entities in Cambodia said to be running scam centers focusing on digital currency fraud. And the problem is getting more complex and widespread. According to a recent UN report, cyber fraud rooted in Southeast Asia has spread to South America, Africa and Eastern Europe, with staggering losses amounting to almost $6 billion just in US alone. But experts question just how effective these sanctions are, because the organized crime groups have long established underground banking infrastructure here in Southeast Asia to continue move money and launder them. They are able to continue have financial access without having to go through the formal financial institutions. And despite the sanctions, but having said that, sanctions are an effective tool to raise attention to further shine a spotlight on these pressing issues.
We're also quite concerned about an impact this has on cooperation between countries, both at the regional level but also bilaterally between Thailand and Cambodia. Because in the end, these criminal groups use borders for their advantage. They know that it's more difficult to find them, to get hold of them if they cross borders. And so it's really necessary for the countries to work together to address this issue.
But Malaysia, as the host for ASEAN this year, its Home Minister Saifuddin Nasution at this ASEAN Ministerial Summit on Transnational Crime was quick to give his assurance that the recent border conflict and the political uncertainties have not affected cooperation on the ground at all to fight the scourge. The border conflicts between Thailand and Cambodia, has it affected trust and confidence?
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, I happen to be represented Malaysia during the last extraordinary meeting on trans-border. We did in Wisma Pertahanan, Kuala Lumpur. So I'm confident that we can manage it successfully.
Earlier, we also spoke with Dr. Gregory Raymond, Senior Lecturer, Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University, and he explains to us how major powers such as China and the US factor into Southeast Asia's fight against transnational crime.
China's got a very important role here. It is, in some respects, somewhat conflicted role. On the one hand, it is Chinese origin criminals that are leaving China with capital to set up these enterprises in host states in mainland Southeast Asia. They are sort of on the run from the Chinese authorities and periodically are subject to intervention and law enforcement crackdowns from China. But at the same time, we've seen that China won't go after some of the more significant figures in these operations. And this is for the reason, or it's often hypothesized that this is for the reason that these figures are quite close to the elites of some of the countries in mainland Southeast Asia. So they provide a conduit to some of the regimes in mainland Southeast Asia and China's unwilling to try to crack down on these. So, we see that China will periodically produce what's often a fairly performative piece of police enforcement, but then for long periods of time, it won't do a great deal. So China potentially could do more, but will it? We wait to see. At the same time, the United States is enforcing sanctions on individuals that it identifies as being key figures in these movements, but these sanctions don't seem to be able to actually restrain these criminal figures. And this has included some politicians in Cambodia. More recently, in fact today, it announced some sanctions on some of the figures on the Myanmar-Thai border. But what we've seen to date is these figures don't particularly want to travel. They're not often vulnerable to the kinds of police actions which might follow these sanctions, and they're able to move and launder their money through a range of high-tech channels. That really means that they're largely out of the reach of US law enforcement.
Now, India is reportedly working to obtain rare earth samples from Myanmar's Kachin Independence Army. According to Reuters, New Delhi is seeking alternative supplies amid Beijing's tight control of the minerals. Reuters sources say India's mining ministry has asked state-owned and private companies to look into getting samples from mines in northeast Myanmar that are under the control of the Kachin armed group. And New Delhi is reportedly hoping to test those samples in domestic labs to see if they contain enough levels of heavy rare earths that can be processed into magnets for electric vehicles and other equipment. Reuters says it signals a rare instance of India engaging with a non-state actor in Myanmar. Now, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi last month said that he discussed rare earths with Myanmar's army chief Min Aung Hlaing at a meeting in China, but did not elaborate. Now, rare earths are relatively abundant, but China has near absolute control over their processing. Beijing has also restricted exports to major economies, including India, this year, amid trade tensions with Washington. Another breaks up next, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Kim Jong-un hails North Korea's absolute status and security as he marked the founding day anniversary of the regime. Plus, elite kindergartens and admission tests, not for kids, but dogs. See why some South Koreans are spending big bucks on their fur kids. China is calling on its citizens in Nepal to pay close attention to safety after the Himalayan nation's worst unrest in decades. Kathmandu is under curfew and armed soldiers are patrolling the streets after 2 days of deadly protests saw government buildings and politicians' homes set on fire. The turmoil was sparked by discontent over the government's social media ban, but it quickly evolved into calling for new polls, with many accusing the ruling elite of widespread corruption. The demonstrations also triggered the resignation of Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli. China says it hopes the country can quickly restore order and national stability, adding that it has asked Nepal to safeguard the security of its citizens and institutions. Beijing says it has not received any reports of Chinese nationals getting hurt in the protests. Well, a bipartisan delegation of U.S. lawmakers is set to visit China later this month. It would be the first visit since 2019 by members of the House, and it comes amid a period of heightened tensions between Beijing and Washington. Well, organizing this trip is Representative Adam Smith, who's also the top Democrat of the House Armed Services Committee. Mr. Smith, speaking with NBC News, said it is unclear at this stage if the group would get to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Mr. Smith, expressing his deep concerns, said both nations appear to be talking less and less, adding that they need to figure out a way to resolve differences. China has presented an official complaint to Japan over a report of former Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen visiting the country. The Foreign Ministry says Beijing firmly opposes any Taiwan independent separatists visiting countries that have diplomatic relations with China. Ms. Tsai's office says she is visiting Japan on a personal trip and has no official schedule. Japanese media say there are no plans for her to meet government officials or politicians. Back in 2022, Ms. Tsai angered China by receiving then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi at the presidential office. Beijing views Taiwan as part of its territory. Now, it sees contact with officials from other nations as a violation of the One China policy. This is Ms. Tsai's third overseas visit since leaving office in May last year. Her two earlier trips were to Europe. A North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, has greeted overseas troops and hailed the position of his country in a Founding Day anniversary speech. State media say the country marked its founding day, the 9th of September, with mass dances and fireworks yesterday. Footage shows the leader and officials raising red scarves to make an oath of allegiance to the nation. Mr. Kim saluted troops deployed to overseas military missions and said North Korea's prosperity, quote, cannot be reversed by any force. South Korean intelligence estimates some 2,000 North Korean soldiers sent to fight for Russia in its war against Ukraine have been killed. And Pyongyang is also planning to deploy another 6,000 troops. About 1,000 North Korean combat soldiers are already in Russia. Well, it seems like more and more families in South Korea are welcoming dogs into their homes instead of babies. Another pain point for policymakers who are wrestling with the nation's low birth rate. Some of these poor parents are paying hundreds of dollars to secure spots in good kindergartens for their pets. And sometimes it can be rough going, as CNA's senior correspondent Lee Myung-suk finds out.
Students rush in, eager not to be late for class. Except these students walk on four legs, bark, and wag their tails. This is a dog kindergarten in Seoul, where pets learn obedience, social skills, and group play. To get admitted, they have to first undergo a 3-hour test.
보호자님이랑 성향 테스트 직전 상담이 있어요. 질문지를 통해서 아이가 어떤 환경에서 어떻게 지냈고 이 아이가 집에서는 어떤 긴장도를 가지고 있고 그거에 대한 거가 이제 우리가 흔히 얘기하는 레벨 테스트 정도가 되겠죠.
She says the kindergarten doesn't reject dogs. Instead, the test seeks to place dogs in the right class. They learn nose work, to look for food, eating manners, and ways to strengthen the muscles in a fitness class. But at this center in Seongnam City that offers kindergarten, daycare, grooming, and boarding services, dogs can be turned away if they fail its test. Trainers say they watch for frustration or defensive behavior. If dogs show possessiveness, they may not be admitted. Responding when called is also critical in emergencies. It says the screening test is vital for safety, with dozens of dogs sharing the same space.
안전상의 문제나 걱정이 많으시니까 조금 더 꼼꼼하게 뭐 안전상이라든지 아이에 대해서 더 많이 성향 알려고 파악하려고 하는 부분이 있고 어떻게 보면 좀 까칠하게 느껴지실 수도 있어요. 사고도 없고 좀 건강한 센터가 되지 않을까
Dogs that fail often go to training academies first. These are like cram schools and are part of a growing pet education market in South Korea.
우리는 밖에서 이제 보통 일을 하고 학교를 가고 나가는 경우들이 많은데 이제 개들이 집에 혼자 오래 있거나 하면 생기는 문제들이 있어요. 근데 그런 거를 미연에 방지하고자 오시는 보호자분들도 많이 계시고요. 그러니까 훈련소에 갈 만큼은 아니지만 얘네도 교육이 필요하다에 대해서 느끼는 우리는 아이다 보니까 가족이야.
And like children's education, it doesn't come cheap. The Korea Consumer Agency says the average monthly cost for a dog to attend kindergarten in Seoul last year was about 255,000 won, or roughly $180, higher than the average cost of early childhood education in the capital city. The pet market in South Korea is growing rapidly as the nation's birth rate drops and more households raise companion animals. About 15 million people in South Korea were raising pets as of end 2022, according to the Agriculture, Food, and Rural Affairs Ministry. The size of the related market stood at about $5.7 billion then. It is estimated to reach about $15 billion by 2027. As the pet industry grows in South Korea, experts say demand will not just be for kindergartens, but also senior dog care as these children age alongside their owners. Lim Yan-suk, CNA, Seoul.
Well, Apple has rolled out its next generation of iPhones amid the squeeze of a global trade war. It's the first such release since President Trump's return to the White House and his renewed tariff campaign. Well, Ira Spitzer files this report for CNA from Silicon Valley.
Apple promised this would be an awe-dropping launch event, and its CEO Tim Cook teed up the annual product unveiling by pushing the company's love of design.
At Apple, design has always been fundamental to who we are and what we do. For us, design goes beyond just how something looks or feels. Design is also how it works.
Powerful, yet so...
This year saw a new model, the iPhone Air, marking the first major redesign since 2017. At just 5.6 millimeters wide, it's the company's lightest and thinnest phone to date. And as expected, the company announced the iPhone 17. It is 3 times more scratch-resistant and powered by the A19 iPhone chip. They come with no major upgrades to Apple's AI assistant Siri, but technology analyst Carolina Milanese, the founder of the Heart of Tech, believes that's fine for most consumers.
Not very many consumers are running to a store asking for AI. What they want is, a better picture, a better video, a user experience throughout the device. And I think that is what Apple is continuing to do. And I think once Siri will hit the market, they will deliver even more to the consumer.
The new AirPods Pro 3 model will feature AI-driven live translation, allowing users to translate foreign language conversations in real time. It follows a recent Google announcement of live translation in phone calls. And the company is doubling down on its health aid ambitions, with the latest Apple Watch including a blood pressure monitor which can detect hypertension.
I think that Apple is really bringing to fruition a vision that Steve Jobs had a long time ago about disrupting the whole health system in some way, giving the power back to the consumer to control their journey to a better health.
This launch may not be enough to overcome doubts about whether Apple is doing enough to keep up with its competitors in the AI race. That may have to wait until a planned major overhaul of Siri, which is now scheduled for spring of 2026. For CNA, I'm Ira Spitzer in Silicon Valley.
Well, hope you've enjoyed this Wednesday edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia, and you can always find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching. Good night.